Hi, this video is about a topic that's been kind of bouncing around my mind for a few days, and essentially, I was picturing what it would be like if the world magically became much more accessible. I was imagining a world where, from when children are really small, they're given a lot more information about different ways that their brain might work, different ways that they might communicate, different sensory needs that they could have. And well, this was initially prompted by thinking that this might be helpful for autistic children to learn more about themselves and to realize that it's okay to be to have a unique communication style. I started thinking that actually this wouldn't be bad for non-autistic individuals either, or even neurotypical individuals. After all, neurotypical people aren't a monolith; they can have different sensory needs and communication styles, and the chance to think about that more and to have more acceptance and knowledge of that from an early age could be a really good thing for them as well. And this led into kind of a broader curiosity about the concept of privilege and discrimination and whether it actually harms people who might be perceived as relatively privileged, as well as those who might currently be facing a lot of inaccessibility and barriers. The way that I've typically heard privilege discussed is sort of based on a relative advantage in access that someone might have. I'm sure that there's different definitions, and I'm not at all claiming that this is the perfect one, but it's sort of the working definition that I'll use for this video. So for example, if someone is able to enter a building using the stairs, and the building only has stairs, that person is going to have privilege in accessing the building relative to someone who needs a wheelchair accessible ramp to enter the building. Yeah, so the example that I wanted to focus on though is actually medical appointments. So you could imagine someone who uses a device to communicate. So instead of speaking, this person might use an AAC device. That often takes longer, and ideally there would be extended appointment times to be able to best make sure that patients who use AAC have the same opportunity to get all of their questions addressed. But of course, in reality, we know that appointment times are often pretty limited and might feel rushed for anyone, even people speaking to communicate, and might feel that much more rushed for someone who uses AAC to communicate. On top of that, to the best of my admittedly somewhat limited understanding, there might also be other concerns like, is scheduling the appointment going to be a challenge if it requires a phone call to schedule? What if the device, freezes during the middle of the appointment? And so if someone doesn't have all those worries to contend with, I think that is certainly relatively an advantage, certainly an ease of access to healthcare. I do think that something this example illustrates is that neurotypical privilege isn't always unique to neurotypical individuals in the sense that someone can be neurodivergent. I'm neurodivergent myself, but I don't generally have to worry about AAC specific considerations. And so in that area, I have, I guess, what could be considered privilege as well. Likewise, someone who's neurotypical might actually end up facing overlapping barriers for a different reason. So if a patient is using an interpreter, in some cases, they might also feel a similar time crunch with their appointments. I still think that it's definitely worth becoming familiar with different barriers that others experience, and it can be helpful to realize that our own experience in life certainly is not the most unique one. There might be areas that we face challenges where others have it pretty easy on average. And conversely, there might be areas that are pretty easy for us where others are experiencing challenges that we might not even be aware of. Even in the example I gave, there's definitely possibly nuances of that example that I'm overlooking because I haven't had that experience personally, and so I might just not be aware of it. And I do think that for neurotypical people in particular, it can sometimes be easy to go through life, or at least easier on average, to go through life without really thinking about accommodations or disability or accessibility, because most places will be, again, on average, relatively more set up to your communication style and needs. So I actually really respect neurotypical people who go out of their way to learn about accessibility and disability. Um, I do think there's an interesting question, probably outside the scope of my knowledge in general, but are there areas of relative disadvantage on average? Or areas where, on average, neurodivergent people might experience some kind of advantage? I think that there may be. Probably not so much with tangible advantages like employment, healthcare. We know that neurodivergent people on average face a lot of gaps in access there. But I do think that being neurodivergent or just being different in general can often prompt people to think and reflect deeply. And I think that there can be a value within that. But the main reason that I was interested in making this video was actually to discuss this idea of absolute privilege. So we might think about relative advantages between neurotypical people and neurodivergent people on average, with respect to, accessing healthcare, social acceptance, accessing employment, and so on. But does this privilege extend to kind of all iterations of the world? So if we were to imagine a lot of parallel universes that had different degrees of acceptance of neurodivergent individuals, and where there were different degrees of gaps. So just say, for the sake of the argument, that neurotypical people on average are twice as likely to be able to access the healthcare that they need. Okay, now we have this universe where it's 1.5 times as likely, and now we have this world where it's equal, where neurodivergent people have caught up to neurotypical people, and everyone has, we'll also assume, just for the sake of the argument, that all people in general have equal access to healthcare. That's certainly better for neurodivergent people. Is it also better for neurotypical people? I think it absolutely is. And that's why I think the idea of privilege is almost a slightly strange one, because it kind of implies that people are being advantaged by these gaps in access. And while they might be on the upper hand of the gap, they are still, I think, disadvantaged. I think everyone is disadvantaged by the fact that the gap exists. So going back to this healthcare access analogy, firstly, what would it take for healthcare to become accessible for neurodivergent people? It would take probably a lot of things, but just to throw out a couple of examples, it would probably be a more customizable environment where maybe there's different options for scheduling. Maybe you can schedule online instead of through the phone, because a lot of neurodivergent people have phone anxiety. Maybe there's a sensory-friendly environment in the waiting area. Or maybe you can even wait in your car and get a text to come in when the appointment's ready. Maybe there's options for customized appointment times. So if you need, you can book an extended appointment time without having to worry about incurring a lot of extra cost. I don't think that any of these changes would be bad for neurotypical people, even if someone doesn't need a particular one, just like some people might not need a wheelchair accessible ramp. The presence of the ramp certainly isn't doing any harm, even to people who don't need it. And it's really beneficial for the people who do. And in addition, I think neurotypical people often can benefit from some of these things, just it's maybe not as pressing of a need for them on average. For example, most people, I would imagine, feel a bit more comfortable in a sensory-friendly environment than in an environment that's really chaotic and has sudden, unexpected loud noises blaring in the background. So that in itself, I think, would be a net advantage for everyone. And secondly, if we imagine this world where neurodivergent people now have more access, or kind of equal access to education, healthcare, employment, etc., and where all people have that access, that means that there's so many more people who are able to use their creativity and skills in a way that otherwise could have been impeded by having to spend that energy going through all these barriers and difficulties. So there could be a lot more people who otherwise wouldn't have had access to go into fields like medicine who now are able to. So maybe there'd be a lot more healthcare advances just because there's a lot more people with the capacity now and energy to work on certain healthcare problems. Um, maybe someone who in a different world would have failed the interview because the interview team thought they were too strange or didn't make enough eye contact, now would have been able to get a job where they can really make a difference in healthcare. So I'd imagine that that would just improve the quality of medical advances in healthcare for everyone. Um, with that said, I'm hesitant to leave the reasoning there because this almost might give rise to the idea that unless someone is hiding, kind of a savant-like skill that is just waiting for a more accepting world for them to be able to use it, that that's really that otherwise there's not a lot of advantage to their inclusion. And I don't think that's the case. I also think that if we take as fundamental the idea that everyone has immense internal value and something to offer to the world, then it necessarily follows that anytime people are being disadvantaged or excluded or just facing barriers to accessing community, that of course those individuals are in need of support primarily, but also that everyone else who in a parallel universe might have had the opportunity to form relationships with that individual and to be enriched by those relationships and to learn from them, that now those people are also going to be the worse for missing out on that. That we probably have things that we don't even know that we don't know because there's people in our world who aren't given the equal opportunity to share their perspectives and wants and needs, and we're missing out because of that. I think in particular, people can grow up realizing that their acceptance is to some extent contingent on their abilities. So if you grow up in an environment where disabled people aren't treated as well, aren't given the same opportunities, even as a non-disabled individual, one might start to realize, even if they're not consciously thinking about it, hey, I probably wouldn't have the same friendships I do if I became disabled, or if I wasn't able to produce as much, or to be as successful, or to, maybe be as socially typical. If I become too strange, or if I'm not productive enough, then maybe people won't want me around anymore. What if someone does use their privilege or advantage in some area to hurt another person? So you can imagine someone who really goes out of their way to bully a neurodivergent person, maybe in their workplace, because they perceive that the individual won't have as much ability to fight back. Not physically necessarily, but even socially. Maybe they assume that other people won't believe the neurodivergent individual enough, or maybe other people don't really have close relationships with the neurodivergent individual, and so that person is kind of easy to target. So in this hypothetical scenario, the first person just kind of relentlessly bullies the neurodivergent individual, causing a lot of trauma and pain to the person. That is, of course, terrible. And if this was a situation that we were actually able to intervene in some way, the main focus would, of course, be the well-being of the neurodivergent individual who's being bullied. But what I want to discuss, not because I think it's the most important part of the situation, but because I think it's interesting, is how does this hypothetical scenario influence the well-being of the person doing the bullying? I would say that it's actually hurting that person as well. I think, again, if we take as kind of foundational the idea that people are going to be at their best and at their healthiest when they are able to be compassionate towards themselves and towards others, and when they're able to form kind and healthy and respectful relationships with others, anything that drives the person away from that is then going to be to their detriment as well, in addition to the detriment of whoever they may be hurting in the process. And bullying certainly is, bullying combined with active discrimination in this case, certainly is not bringing someone closer to that kind of kind, mutually respectful mindset. If anything, it's probably allowing the person to funnel whatever insecurity or problem or frustration in their own life that really needs to be dealt with into this target, this person who's become a target for them, in a way that they're just kind of avoiding dealing with the root of their problem. And so, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this. I realize that this is maybe a bit of an unusual topic. I would definitely welcome any thoughts or feedback that other people have. And thank you once again. Bye.